Welcome back to Simplified Human Physiology. I'm Dave. I will be your teacher. This is Module 2, and it's called Where Does Our Food Go? Digestion. We're going to start out with some basic organs of digestion, and then we'll get more into exactly what happens inside of these organs. Let's take a look at this. And some things we can see are, first of all, we can see our lungs, left lung, right lung, heart right in the middle. Okay. Here are some major blood vessels, some of them coming down to the heart, some going away from the heart. Here's our voice box right here. And as we go further south, we see the liver. Notice it's a little bit on the right side of the body, about halfway down. It's quite large. Here's the stomach. It's a little bit on the left side of the body. All right. And this is the small intestines. It's all coiled up. It's around 15 to 16 feet long. And we see also the large part of the large intestine is coming up here and then going around here, but we can't see it. It's under the small intestines. So that's about it for this picture. Let's see what we can see in another picture. This time we see the food tube or the esophagus coming down. The esophagus is about 10 inches long, about an inch wide. And then, of course, we have the stomach. The stomach could hold about a liter of food, maybe a liter and a half on Thanksgiving. Its whole purpose, of course, is to churn the food, kind of mix it up with digestive juices. And we go from the stomach into something called the duodenum. That's the first part of the small intestines. We'll be spending some time on it when we get to that part of the unit here today. The duodenum flows into the small intestines, which again you can see all coiled up here. The small intestine again is around 18 feet long and about an inch in diameter. And then finally, things will move into the large intestine. At this point, go up, across, down, and stored in the rectum right here before it is evacuated or expelled out through the anus right here. You can see a picture of the liver here. They kind of moved it away, so it's kind of hard to see, but again, it's a little on the right side of your body. Okay. Let's take a look at one more picture, kind of showing the whole view of things. And again, here we have the esophagus coming down into the stomach. Here's the liver, a little bit on the right side. Here we can see the gallbladder, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It's related to the liver, and it has to do with the duodenum, which is right here. And we can see better now that the duodenum leads into the small intestines, which is all curled up. The small intestines is where all food is absorbed into the bloodstream. And then when we move away from the small intestine, we go into the large intestine, also called the colon, up, across, down, stored in the rectum, and then expelled. All right. So that's kind of an overview of the major organs of digestion. Let's see what's involved in the food that we eat. These are the so-called nutrients, and there are basically 6 nutrients. There are carbohydrates, and here are examples of carbohydrates. You might probably learn this from earlier years in school. Fats would be the other food component. Here's some examples of fats. Proteins would be the third component, and examples of proteins. Now, the reason I have these lines here is that these are the foods that will be digested. All right. Now we have 3 other nutrients which are not to be digested but will be entering the digestive system. Vitamins will come from the plants that we eat. Minerals will also come from the plants that we eat. Examples of minerals are calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium, potassium, and chloride. And then finally, water is a major nutrient which does not need to be digested. So this gives you kind of an overview of the food that's going into our bodies. Let's look at the idea behind digestion before we get back into the organs. The complex carbohydrates that we eat, which are made up of hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, the whole idea behind digestion is to break the complex carbohydrates into simple carbohydrates. The simplest of the carbohydrates is called glucose, and glucose is primarily the energy molecule, giving us the energy that we need for all the activities in our body. Once the digestive system has broken everything down into glucose, the glucose will enter the bloodstream and be taken to the body cells. Then we have the complex fats. Fats are also made up of hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, just in a different ratio. The idea behind digesting is to break the complex fats into simple fats. And simple fats are called fatty acids. And they are used primarily in the cell membrane, which we'll talk in more detail later. Once the digestion has brought us fatty acids, the fatty acids will enter the bloodstream and be taken to the body cells. And finally, we have the proteins. Now, here's something a little bit different. Complex proteins are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but also nitrogen. This is the way nitrogen gets into our bodies, not through the air that we breathe. The complex proteins are going to be broken down into simple proteins, which are called amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of our cells. Those are the substances that we need to make new cells and for repair. Once we have these amino acids, they enter the bloodstream and are taken to all the body cells. So that gives us an overview of digestion. Let's get back to the organs and see what's happening. Here we see an obvious picture of the mouth, the nose, which is not involved in digestion. But as we chew and eat the food, the first digestion begins in the mouth. And in the saliva, a certain digestive juice is released, which starts the breakdown of carbohydrates. Now, this is where we're going to swallow the food, and the food goes down this tube right here. This is the esophagus, all right, the food tube, not to be confused with this tube, which is the windpipe. This is the trachea. Excuse me. And when we swallow, a little flap of skin covers over the trachea so that food does not mistakenly go down the trachea into our lungs. By the way, this is the backbone here, which of course contains the spinal cord. So let's follow the esophagus about 10 inches down and see where it goes. This picture is an interesting one. It shows the action of the esophagus as it propels the food down toward the stomach. The food does not drop by gravity. It is actually pushed along by muscular contractions in a form of a wave. So push, 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 push into the stomach. Is that upside down? I can't tell. Yeah, sorry, upside down there. Okay, we arrive in the stomach. Here's the esophagus coming down, all right. Here is the tube that leaves the stomach going to the duodenum, which we can't see right here. In the stomach, by the way, the stomach capacity is around a liter, could be up to a liter and a half. It mainly churns the food, and once the food is chewed in the mouth, comes down into the stomach, it will be slowly churned and mixed, and this is where protein digestion begins. There is a release of a digestive juice that breaks down proteins, but to enable that to happen, first hydrochloric acid has to be secreted into the stomach. Hydrochloric acid has a few purposes. One, it will kill any bacteria that are in the food that should not be there. Secondly, it will enable the digestive juice to do its job when food is in there. If the digestive juice does its job when there's no food, it will actually digest the stomach. So we have to be kind of careful there that when the hydrochloric acid is secreted, it enables the enzyme to do its job of digesting the food and not the stomach. To protect the stomach, excuse me, to protect the stomach from the hydrochloric acid, the lining of the stomach secretes a very thick mucus layer. Mucus is, when you have a cold and you blow your nose, what comes out is mucus. And so that mucus lines the stomach layer and keeps the stomach safe from the hydrochloric acid. The acid is strong enough that it will burn through your skin. It has a pH of about 1 or 2, which is very, very acidic. So again, the purpose of the stomach is primarily protein digestion. We have another picture of the stomach. This one emphasizes the musculature. All right, it's a very muscular organ. Again, here's where the esophagus comes down, and here's where the duodenum begins. There's a valve right here, by the way, and in fact, there's a valve up here too. There's a valve right here that when the food goes into the stomach, the valve closes so that the hydrochloric acid cannot by accident go up into the esophagus. The esophagus is not protected from the acid, so this valve has to be closed when the stomach is churning. There's another valve right here which allows food to leave the stomach and go into the duodenum. This picture is a nice lining of the stomach, and we see there's musculature at the bottom here, which we would expect. And then there are various glands and pits here. The glands would secrete the digestive juices into the stomach, which would break down the proteins. And also we have the gastric pits here, which secrete the hydrochloric acid into the stomach also. This whole size here would be about 1 millimeter. So we're talking about very, very tiny amounts. Here's a picture that better shows the glands from which the digestive juices are made and are secreted, and also the gastric pits from where the hydrochloric acid comes. Here we see, let me get it right here. Yeah, there we go. Here we see the end of the stomach, begin the duodenum, and here we see the beginning of the small intestines. Again, it's all coiled up to save space, and this, which you see right here, is called connective tissue. Connective tissue is throughout the body, and what it does is basically holds things together. Okay. Here's a nice shot of the liver and the stomach and the duodenum. By the way, duodenum is kind of a fancy way to say the number 12. Duo is 2 and deme is 10, so 2 and 10 is 12. It's the first 12 inches of the small intestine, okay? And the reason we spend some attention to it is because things happen there. Let's look at what does happen. First of all, carbohydrate digestion continues in this area because the pancreas, which you cannot see right here, is going to secrete digestive juices to continue carbohydrate digestion. But secondly, fat digestion begins in the duodenum. This thing right here is the gallbladder, and it contains bile that was made by the liver. It's stored in the gallbladder until the bile is needed by the fats. Here's what happens. When the fats come down from the stomach into the duodenum, the gallbladder pushes some bile down into the duodenum, and it mixes with the fats and basically breaks the fats into small particles for easier digestion. Then the pancreas, which we'll see in a future picture, secretes an enzyme which will break down the fats chemically, all right? And then they continue along into the small intestines. Okay. This next picture shows a nice shot of the pancreas where it is. Upside down. There we go. Okay. So again, here's the gallbladder. It's going to secrete some bile into the duodenum, which is here. And here is the pancreas, exactly where it should be. The pancreas has two functions. One function is digestive, so it mainly secretes enzymes for carbohydrate digestion and for fats digestion. It also secretes insulin, which of course is important, that if you don't have enough insulin, you have diabetes. And we'll get back to that another time. So as the food continues along into the small intestines, we can assume that the proteins have been digested, the fats have been digested, and the carbohydrates have been digested, and now it's time for them to enter the bloodstream. But before we do that, there's something I need to go over with you, because we're going to use this word quite a bit throughout the whole course. And the word is diffusion. It's a very simple concept. It means that if you have a whole bunch of particles crowded together in a liquid environment, for example, if this is all water, and these are particles, and it's real crowded here, that the particles will move from a place that's crowded toward a place where it's not crowded. In other words, the particles will spread out evenly in all directions until it's evenly crowded. All right? So diffusion always goes from a place of crowded to a place of non-crowded. And we will see this throughout the body with a variety of different particles, including gases. This is quite important when we have two areas of the body that are separated by a membrane. And if these particles are allowed to go through the membrane, guess which way they're going to go? They're going to go from a place of crowded particles toward a place of less crowded particles until both sides have equal spreading of particles. And we call this diffusion. Okay? This is upside down again. I'm looking at this upside down because of our camera position, so pardon me if I'm making a mistake. This is a picture of the small intestines. And it's, again, about 1 inch across, or about 2.5 centimeters, and our digested food is traveling through here. It takes about 8 to 10 hours to go through the small intestine, so there's plenty of time for the food to diffuse from the small intestine into the blood supply, which is in the walls of the small intestine. Okay? And as we're going to see very soon here, the small intestine is covered with tiny little projections. Each of these projections is about a millimeter or so. And what it does is add more surface area for the food particles to diffuse from the hollow space of the small intestine into the bloodstream. And these little finger-like projections are all throughout the lining of the small intestine. In fact, I have a visual aid here. Let's pretend that this is a part of the small intestine, okay? It's actually a little bit bigger. If I were to take the whole length of the small intestine and cut it open like this and spread it out as flat as a pancake, just like that, and then take an iron and iron it completely flat as a pancake as I could, it would cover a space equal to a tennis court, about 200 square meters. Now that's a lot of diffusing surface area, and Mother Nature has prepared the small intestine so that that amount of food particles can diffuse into the bloodstream. By the way, here's another visual aid. That's the actual diameter of the small intestine, about an inch. Okay. Here at the top we have a picture, obviously, of the small intestine. Here's a blow-up of those fingers that stick out into the hollow space of the small intestine. This has the fancy name of villi, V-I-L-L-I, because that's Latin for finger. I can't keep calling these fingers. And so the villi stick out into the small intestine, increasing the surface area. Here we take a look at just one of the villi, again, 1 millimeter, about 1 millimeter high, and you can see the blood vessels inside waiting to receive the food particles, the food molecules, I should say, that are diffusing from the hollow of the small intestine into the bloodstream. And the bloodstream will take those food particles to the body cells. This next picture is a nice shot of the villus, of the finger projection. Again, you can see the blood vessels inside the villus waiting for the food particles to take them to the body cells. Okay, and finally, when all the food has been absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream, and we're talking about 99.9% of the available food molecules, whatever is left over moves into the large intestine, which we see here. The large intestine begins right here. It goes up, it goes across, it goes down, it stores in the rectum, and then finally goes out through the anus here. Here we see major blood vessels, which we'll talk about when we get to that part of the course. But the blood vessels are quite large here. Anyway, back to the large intestine, which is also called a colon, by the way. If you'd like to call it the colon, that would be fine. A little bit easier to say. Whatever is entering the large intestines, or the colon, and we now call feces, because it has no nutritive value to us. It consists mainly of undigested food, like the peelings of things like grains and like celery, what do you call them, little celery strings, things like that will continue into the large intestine. It will take about 8 to 10 hours to go through the large intestine, during which time you might be surprised to know that there are 20 gazillion bacteria living in your large intestines, in your colon. Mother Nature put them there, and normally they're harmless to us. What they do is to actually eat whatever is left over, whatever we call the feces. The bacteria have a nice warm place. There's very moist, and there's lots of this leftover bacteria food for them, and so they occupy. They're called gut bacteria. They live in the gut, and they decay the food further, not the food, the feces further as the feces passes through. They also produce gases sometimes. Sometimes methane, which is what you use to heat your home in the winter, and sometimes hydrogen sulfide, which is kind of a stinky gas. And of course, when those gases expand, you know where they go, right? We don't need to talk about that. Okay. What else about the large intestines? Let's see. Here, oh, by the way, there is, right here at the beginning of the large intestine, is the appendix. The appendix has no known purpose. It just gets infected now and then, and we have to have it removed. Another nice picture of the large intestines, going up, across, down, and out. This is all connective tissue, just holding the intestines together. All right. By the way, around 7 liters of water enter the small intestines, and all that water is absorbed, and about another 1.5 liters of water continues into the large intestines, and a lot of that water is absorbed also back into the body. It's recycled, so that when the feces actually comes out, it only takes about 100 milliliters of water with it, which is about 1/10 of a liter. By the way, I'm going to use the liter throughout the course because it is so common to use, and it's used in science all the time. I want to show you how much a liter looks like. This, probably familiar to most of you, is half a liter. All right. So when I say liter, I'm talking about 2 of these. Okay, 2 of these worth. By the way, there was another visual aid I was going to use. This is the diameter of the large intestines, which is about 5 feet long, about 1.5 meters, and about 3 inches across, or about 6.5 centimeters. Quite a bit different than the diameter of the small intestine, which we see right there. Okay. I'd like to use the analogy of a bricklayer in explaining what happens to the food that we eat. I'll cut this off there. Okay. Actually, I'm going to tell you the story before I show this to you. Okay? I want you to imagine that there's a bricklayer. His job is to make a brick wall. All right? And he has a plan in his head of how to make the brick wall, a blueprint or a plan, right? But that's not enough. He needs materials. And the materials are going to be bricks and mortar and cement to make the wall, right? Okay, very good. And he needs energy so that he can actually lift the bricks and put the mortar in and do all the muscle work that is necessary to make the wall. Now, with that analogy in mind, I'd like to show you what happens inside the body. This is the bricklayer analogy. So the bricklayer is your body cell, okay? And what the cells need to constantly do is make new cells, either to divide into daughter cells or for repair, all right? So they need a plan. The plan is located in the nucleus of the cells, in the chromosomes and the genes, which we know as the DNA. The DNA plan tells it's the blueprint for how to make things. We also need bricks to make the brick wall. Well, the brick wall, the bricks are the amino acids. Those are the building blocks. We also need to give the bricklayer energy so he can pick up the bricks and do the work. And that's the job of, we also need the fatty acids help to make with the mortar and the cement to help put the bricks together. And finally, we need energy for the work to be done, and that comes from the glucose that has been digested down and is now entering the cells. So here's the amino acid, the bricks, the fatty acids, the mortar and cement, and the glucose is the energy for the bricklayer to do his work. I hope this helps to explain a little bit more what our food is for. Okay? Hi, I'm back. I'm going to wrap up today's module with this. This, as you may recognize, is a piece of poop or a piece of feces. Now, scientists call it a stool. And the interesting thing, and I was surprised when I first found out about this, is that about a third of your stool that come out of you into the toilet is actually bacteria that are living in your colon. You've got so many gazillions of the bacteria that they're not even missed, because they will reproduce and keep their population high in your gut. But I just thought this is kind of an interesting thing. 1/3 of your stool is likely dead bacteria, maybe a few live ones too. Okay, to wrap up, we're going to go over some of the conditions. I wouldn't call them quite diseases, but conditions in your digestive system. One of them is heartburn. People who experience heartburn, what happens is that some of the hydrochloric acid from the stomach works its way up into the esophagus. Remember, there's supposed to be a valve there that keeps that from happening. But if the person eats food and then lies down, sometimes the acid just by gravity flows back into the esophagus. It burns the lining of the esophagus, which is not protected. And because the esophagus is right next to the heart, it feels like the heart is burning, and thus the name heartburn. But the heart is not burning, it is the esophagus. So probably a good idea is not to lie down shortly after you have eaten. There's also a condition called reflux. This is exactly the same as what I just described. There's a backup of the hydrochloric acid into the esophagus, but it happens all the time, whether you're eating or not. That valve is just not working. And there are a variety of things a person can do, from taking antacid pills, and there's actually a surgery that can help that flap to work better and close that valve and keep the acid from moving back into the esophagus. There's a condition called peptic ulcer. This is where the lining of your stomach, which is normally protected by that layer of mucus, for some reason, part of the stomach, the mucus is not working right. It's not protecting that lining of the stomach, and the acid actually breaks through into the stomach lining and burns it. That's called a peptic ulcer. For a long time, it was thought it was caused by stress, too much stress in your life, but lately it's thought that it was more likely caused by a bacterium that lives in the stomach. So anyway, it's very painful. There are some ways that it can be treated, but that is an acid breakthrough into the stomach lining. Food poisoning is probably something you've heard about. This is where food has spoiled. You've left it out too long, and bacteria have found it and start living in the food. And the bacteria produce toxins as they live, poisons. And so if you eat that food and it's got the bacteria toxins in it, obviously you're going to get food poisoning. What happens is these toxins irritate the lining of your stomach, and the stomach sends a message to the brain, and the brain says, get rid of that food, and guess what? Time to vomit. That's usually what happens with food poisoning. Gallstones. Is this the last one? No. All right. The gallbladder, remember, secretes bile, but sometimes the bile over a long period of time crystallizes into, like sometimes honey in a jar becomes crystalline. Same idea. And when the bile becomes crystalline like that, it actually produces small stones. And I have a picture of that, which is just amazing. Let's take a look. In the top layer here, we actually have an X-ray of the gallbladder with stones. You can see the stones in it right there. All right. And here, what we see is the gallbladder opened up, taken out and opened up, and these are the gallstones. And there's a dime to show you how big they are. The problem is that these gallstones will block the tube that drains the bile into the duodenum, and the bile backs up, and it can be very painful, and it could actually cause an infection. So there's a variety of ways this is treated, from high-frequency sound waves to medication, and finally to surgery if they have to be taken out in a gallbladder surgery. The last two of these situations, whoops, there's 3 to go. You recall at the beginning of the colon is the appendix. And normally the appendix doesn't give us any harm, but sometimes bacteria can work its way into the appendix and inflame it and infect it. And it will also produce toxins and become inflamed. And if the appendix bursts before it's taken out, it can actually cause blood poisoning throughout your body. So it's very important that if you have pain in your lower right abdomen, and along with nausea and vomiting, it could be appendicitis, and you should get it checked out right away. Diarrhea. This is interesting. You remember, feces makes its way through the colon, through the large intestine, and one of the main things the colon does is to reabsorb water back into your body. All right? Well, what if for some reason, maybe a disease you have, the feces moves too quickly through the colon, and there's not enough time for the colon to reabsorb that water back into your body? What is your feces going to look like? Very watery feces, and that's the cause of diarrhea. On the other hand, some diseases do the opposite, and some drugs do this also, and that is, instead of the feces moving too quickly through the colon, they move too slowly, and there's plenty of time for the colon to reclaim the water back into the body. And your stool, your feces, becomes hard and dry, and that's called constipation. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this module. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something about your digestive system. The next module we're going to move into is all about breathing, and it's called the respiratory system. We will see you then. Goodbye.